Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
And days are getting shorter here. We're getting towards that equinox time when our days are about the same. So definitely noticing darker, cooler mornings for me. But global weirding you just mentioned. I do hope, I get a little bit nervous when there's a freak snowstorm or something like that people are quick to dismiss global warming. And I think global weirding or climate change is such a more useful term, because we are just seeing bigger storms in places where there weren't storms, and just, weird stuff happening. And I'm mainly hearing about Texas right now.
Yeah. And it's of course impacting all of the center part of the United States really hard. But Texas is unique in a couple of ways. One is that the Texans decided to isolate their grid from the rest of the countries. So they are, if something hits their grid and they have troubles, they're not able to easily access energy from elsewhere, so they're less resilient. And then they have a bunch of natural gas plants that are freezing because they didn't expect these kinds of temperatures. And we know to expect the unexpected now. With climate change. So there's been a lot of kind of dunking on from the right wing of the political spectrum on wind turbines in Texas, but the data shows that that the lion's share of the problem, a huge portion of the problem, is really about fossil fuel assets that are frozen. And you get that double whammy of a peak in demand when there are these extremes, and this is not a problem that's isolated to that area. It happens in summer extremes in Australia as well, where we get this huge peak load when you get hot days because everyone's turning on their air conditioning. And most of the listeners of this show will know that we have a solution for that. Globally, that's right.
We have the technology to fix that and to live in a much more resilient way and with a much lower demand on all the infrastructure. Yeah, and the International Passive House Association is running its Efficiency First campaign right now. Yeah. We'll share some information and links to that. They've got a cool competition about encouraging people to come up with creative new ways to describe Passive House visually. But this drives home again why efficiency just can't be ignored. I mean, as we expand our conversation understanding of zero carbon building to include embodied carbon, to include electrification, and include renewable energy, all of that is really super, important to decarbonizing buildings. But if we abandon or neglect energy efficiency, then we're missing the boat. We're not only are we missing the boat on decarbonization, but we're also risking these kinds of vulnerabilities for huge populations.
around the world as we go through weird weather in it, more and more. So
yeah. Well, there will be more about that coming, and more discussions to be had. But let's get into this week's feature interview. Now, you've been on Ben's show before, is that right?
I have, yeah. It's been a few months, but I had a great time talking with Ben about buildings and the clean energy transition and innovation themes that I bring up probably incessantly on this podcast as well. Really, but it was great, and it was fun to hear about his radio background, which makes total sense. I mean, he is a master communicator, so
he is.
Yeah,
we're talking, of course, about Ben Adam Smith, who is no stranger to radio. He started out back in 1997 as a production assistant. So he worked for over 15 years in television and radio, including a number of years as a presenter before starting his own media company. I first came across Ben Adam Smith when he started out podcasting, and I was actually, I'm not sure how it happened, but ended up in a little mastermind group when he was just getting started. I was starting my own podcast, and we were sort of bumbling along, trying to figure things out in the early days of podcasting. But he, of course, does have all this experience, and his story goes back to coming out of radio and television as an employee and starting his own company and wanting to build a house and starting out pretty completely fresh in the building industry, just as a prospective homeowner. At the time, didn't have a family, but now has since got 2 young children, and has basically documented and broadcast that whole journey of looking at how do I do this, and then learning about Passive House along the way. Ultimately, now living in a passive house, and has made a whole bunch of great content along the way, and built a business out of communicating that message. So yeah, enjoy. It was a great chat. He has actually, Ben and I have exchanged interviews in the past, so he's been on Homestyle Green a couple of times as well. But this was really great to sit down and have a chat with Ben to talk specifically about his journey to Passive House.
It's awesome to chat with you again, Ben. Jeepers, you're up to what podcast? You're almost up to podcast 300.
Yeah, 300 podcasts, and I love it as much as day one. That's the great thing.
That's awesome. But you sound a bit like someone who should be on the radio because you were. You're not an architect or a builder. So for those that haven't come across you before, how did you get into this whole building scene?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I put it down to being at a crossroads in my life. And I was a radio presenter for a good 10, 15 years. Absolutely loved it. The industry I loathed. And I found myself going round and round in circles. So it came to a point of, look, do I want to keep doing this? I can get another job. There's no difficulty in that. But then I'm going to end up here again of technology is taking over and they're needing fewer and fewer presenters. So I thought, well, what do I want to do? What is important to me? And for me, it was issues to do with the planet. I think we've got it all happening at the moment. And it's not just one thing. It's not just climate change. It's deforestation. It's pollution. It's all of these things. They're just catching up with us. And so I wanted to make sure whatever I did next had its focus on the planet. And so then I thought, what else? What else do I like? I like buildings. I love looking around houses. And thus was born House Planning Help, with this idea as well that I was going to build my own house. So 0 experience. That's pretty much the podcast from day one. Why don't I just speak to people? I interview people for a living. So I just make this podcast where I chat to self-builders, those that have been there and done it, and also green building experts.
Yeah, so it was basically taking where you did have experience, which was radio and audio production, and using that as a vehicle to get into and to share your journey to solving your own problem, which was you just needed a house, right? Because I think at the time you were a young couple, you're renting, and you wanted to eventually build a home.
It was exactly that. And it was, to be totally honest, a bit of a dream for a while. I set myself this deadline. I want to build my house before I turn 40 in August 2016. And I kept on saying this in the podcast. It was quite an interesting thing because when it got to August 2016, I didn't even have a piece of land. So I failed spectacularly. But what's strange is a couple of months after that, just this ideal piece of land became available, and we'd put in bids on other pieces and it had all fallen through, or someone had put in more money, whatever it is. We'd had a number of different scenarios. And then everything just happened so quickly because, of course, all this research that I've been doing, I've been networking, I knew all the right people to go to. And one of the things that I find quite interesting looking back after having lived in the house for a couple of years now is that I managed to hire a team of people who had a lot of experience. And I think that has really stood me in a good position for coming away with a house that, yeah, of course, there are little things that you think, oh, wish I'd changed that. But overall, I just think we've got such a great house.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us when, because this was the aim here was just to get a house. When did you first hear about Passive House?
Well, if you look back in the podcast archive, I do think it was a quite early on thing. You know, I interviewed Wolfgang Feist on episode 4 or 5. So it was on the radar. And you probably find this a lot as well. You're doing a podcast about Passive House. But once you start to get into it, you can't really look the other way. It just makes total sense. So I think I had that in my mind, and I was under the impression that I would investigate lots of other things. But really, in the podcast series, it did become a regular feature. And I found myself, I don't really want to go and look at other houses that aren't Passive House or don't have that mindset, because to me, that's a backward step. Of course, I'd like to bring in some of the embodied carbon side of things. I think the two go together very nicely and important, that upfront carbon emissions. But the idea of losing Passive House, let's look at this less good house here. That didn't work for me.
It's so strange. Well, you could see it as coincidence, but I guess it's like you say, a natural progression. We both started our original podcast. I started Homestyle Green at a similar time, and I resisted for a long time.
I remember
to go down this passive. I wanted to be inclusive. I wanted to talk about other things, and Passive House just kept coming back. And I think that's a really good way of describing it. It's similar to going to physical buildings. That once you have been in a house or a building that performs well, you just become less interested in ones that don't.
Yeah, and I find this, if I'm ever going to a conference or anything like that one key bit of information that I give is just make sure, if you have an idea, I'd like to build a passive house, don't be deterred by someone who's never done it, because there are plenty of building products, manufacturers and all the rest of it who maybe their product actually isn't very useful in building a passive house, who may dissuade you or try and water down what you're doing. I think it's just such a great upfront goal, day one of your brief. I'd like to build a certified passive house.
And what about your house? How is you have you've progressed from 40 now, but you do have a house. Tell us about the house that you're living in now.
So, yeah, as I mentioned, that process happened quite quickly. We narrowed down some architects and we got planning permission, which is what we call it in the UK, just the green light to be able to do what we wanted to do. The piece of land, a lot of it you couldn't build on. So it actually had quite a lot of constraints, but that was very useful in developing the design for our house. And one thing that I like looking back at it is thinking, yeah, it developed that way because of the site, because of everything that's gone into it. And I quite like architecture that you can read like that. So that's something that interested me over time as I've gone through interviewing more and more people, when you can look at the building and see how it's come about. So it has got a relatively simple form, as a lot of passive houses do. But I wouldn't say it's boring either. We had quite an interesting sort of to and fro with my wife, because where I started on day one was very much, I love old buildings, and she did as well. So we had this in mind. And then as time went on and I saw more and more modern buildings, I started thinking, well, why do I not want to build like this? Surely that is the way to go. So what I think the architecture firm did so well was try and meet us in the middle here. So hopefully you look at the house and you think that there is something traditional about it. A lot of the materials are traditional, lime render. Also, the window proportions, I think, look quite traditional. But there are other elements, like I really didn't want mullions and transoms going across the windows and things like that. It's just so backward when you can have a good performing triple glazed window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where can people check out what you've ended up with?
I think the best way, pretty much if you come to the website, you will land up on the being able to trace that story. But there was an episode 235, so houseplanninghelp.com/235 condenses everything, the entire journey of the build. And
Nice.
You can have a look at some photos. You can also go through, because this was the other thing, doing a podcast I quite liked and actually miss. I really want to get involved in another project because it's very interesting. When you're in the middle of it, all sorts of issues come out that if you're doing a podcast and you're not interested or you're not in the middle of a process, you can't find those issues. But there are certainly plenty as you go through, and a lot of those we turned into podcasts.
Yeah. Did you do any? What am I trying to say? You're not a passive house designer. Did you get involved technically with any aspects of the building, or did you bring in experts to do everything?
Well, I look at you and think, do I want to go down this route? Because it's certainly something that appeals to me now that perhaps wouldn't have done on day one, thinking that even if I'm not using it as a service, I would love to just get that deeper understanding, because otherwise I think Zach finds this sometimes, doesn't he, that you can be a surface person who understands it, but unless you get deep into the physics of it all, you don't understand it fully. And there are little things that I've seen in presentations. One that comes to mind is Chris Herring from Green Building Store, and they had this lovely slide showing a typical window and how all the drafts and how you get that energy balance going in and out. Whereas when you get to Passive House, it just all makes sense because you're designing it not to have any of those issues. And that's the sort of thing that I'd really like to dig deeper, because every person that I meet that's gone on the course, again, it's this sort of contagious thing that they just want to do more of it. So I never rule it out. I'd love to do as many things to increase my knowledge as possible, but I don't know at this stage that there's a practical application of that.
So for your project, you had a designer, you had a passive house consultant, and then you had a builder. You sort of brought in the team to create the home.
A lot of it was done in-house. So I picked an architecture firm that I knew they'd done plenty of passive houses, which at the time, there weren't a massive amount in the UK. And so that's the route that we went down. We had a local contractor who'd never done it before, but he had the buy-in and was really good. And I don't think anything phased him massively on the build. This is the other thing that's slightly unusual. We went down a brick and block route. This is very popular in the UK. Probably not the best way of doing things, unless you're looking for the cheapest, you're looking for easy trades to find all the rest of it. But I was just fascinated. Why is it the main way that we build in this country? So I'm quite pleased that I've built my own house this way, just to get my head around it, because I don't think there's anything, there's nothing that's stopping us. I've seen other build systems. This is one of the other things that we do at House Planning Help. We have a membership community called The Hub. And because of my background with filming and audio and all the rest of it, we film entire projects. So I've done my own one, which is this masonry build. And then we've got a timber frame project, which uses the PH15 system, I-beams, all of that, very natural materials. And we're just starting another one, actually, which is a retrofit project to Passive House standard, slightly unusual, but it's a terrace property. And then we've done one with ICF. So it's just seeing all the different ways. But I definitely now, I think having gone through it, lean towards natural materials and would love to do a straw bale or something in future, or at least see that process come together.
Yeah. I think that's awesome to have that range, and particularly that bit of a focus now on retrofitting as well. Because I'm glad you brought the hub up, because I don't want to give people the wrong idea that is what you do, as well as the podcast is. Even though you're not a passive house consultant, you help people, right? You help people on this journey of are creating their own home.
Yeah, I think it's such a good thing to be able to get all sorts of different information from different sources. And one thing that might appeal to a lot of people is that I'm not that technical person. I have lots of technical friends, but I can't talk to you in such depth that I completely baffle you. So I think that that's why people come to me. I am on a mission here. I will keep on going to try and make it more and more useful. I see it as it's basically a box, and lots of people do it. Yeah, there are lots of ways of training, and I'm sure if you came to us, it would be very different from certainly if you go to the Passive House Trust, have some brilliant technical information here in the UK, and I will always point people, go and check that out. But what I'm trying to do is, if you're a homeowner who's just a little bit baffled by this, then I want to hold your hand and lead you through the process. And, I mentioned all these videos and things. Just try and simplify it, not overload you, because there are lots of things. And also at that particular time, you'll have certain questions at certain points of the process. So every time I help someone else through, one of the nice things about the hub is we've finally got a number of different houses that we can say, look, these are hub members who have finished these houses, but it's taken a few years to get to that point. And I know where the weak points in the process are, that, they almost like the gaps that I need to fill to just get this. I'd love to get a very clear roadmap of you do this, 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 and this, but it's ongoing.
It's a bit of a challenge because every project is slightly different. So to break it down to that simple recipe,
yes,
is quite hard because even the choice of materials, like you say, it's going to change how the flow of things and then the constraints of a particular piece of land. But I'm guessing that there are a few key things that people should look out for. Have you sort of coalesced and narrowed it down to some of the main tips that people need to think about if they're going down this journey?
Well, I think that everyone goes through the process. So you're all going to be building a house. You're going to need a build system. In the UK, you're going to need something called planning permission. You're going to need a piece of land. So there are definitely things that you can just tick off. But as I mentioned before, there are many different ways of doing some of these things. But things like the build systems, there aren't that many, and particularly if you're interested in low energy. But if you're talking about top tips and things like that, I really come back to some of the basic stuff, which I'm sure everyone knows about, which is, just look at what do you really need. Don't go too big. I always love this phrase. It's from Sarah Suzanka, who wrote the Not So Big House series. And it's about using all the space every day. I just think that immediately sends you to a place of, well, am I going to use this? I'm going to build this. Am I going to use this? And that's what I love about our house. We use it all every day, except for one room that we knew we wouldn't, because we wanted to have one dedicated guest room. But we can actually double up in all sorts of different flexible spaces and have loads of people. We double the kids up, so they share a room. So there's one free there. There's a sitting room, snug area that converts as well. There's my office, which obviously I'm not going to be working at the same time as we've got guests. So we just got this ability to house people, but on a day-to-day basis, our house is sufficient. It's probably, you could have a smaller house, there's no doubt about it, but this piece of land, I mentioned that we looked at all sorts of different ones, and as it happened, we came off, and this is perhaps a downside, that sometimes you just find yourself building to the size of the land. So hopefully we haven't gone completely overboard. We probably built the smallest house you could get away with on our piece of land, but it was 1/2 an acre in a country village, wealthy area.
Do all the people that you end up helping and members of the hub and the community, your listeners, do most of them tend now towards Passive House, or do you help people just in the general process of building any type of house?
That's actually a very good question, because it's hard to know. I think they all like it. Whether they build a certified passive house, I'm not sure all the time. So I don't take that as a given. I just take it from the point of, well, I'm going to talk about certified passive houses because I do think it makes a lot of sense. And then, for one reason or another, people may not go quite that far, but that's fine. As we've said already, everyone's on a different journey, but I think you've just got to provide that information. And this is about building it up as well, that there are so many different things that not every build will use. How you arrange and organize that information, that is, that's quite tricky.
Give us a quick update on the state of standards in the UK. How far away from the requirement is Passive House? I understand you require air tightness testing now, blow door test on most new builds. How much of a gap is there between what would be a stock standard build and Passive House?
Well, I'd love to say that it's gradually getting better, but quite recently there's been a consultation which is looking at the next lot of building regulations, the Future Home Standard, and it's not all of that is moving in the right direction, but I mean, we have some great organizations, as I mentioned already, like the Passive House Trust and Letty, that put together some great packs for us to be able to say, because I mean, some of the consultation, it went on forever. And it was nice to be able to lean on a few templates and really good information, because we all know this makes sense. When we're talking about certified passive house buildings, I think as of last year in the UK, there were 1,300. But we've been on this sort of, year 1, 2, year 2, 10, 15. And then, it is on a curve that is shooting upwards. And last year or the year before, we had another big exciting moment in the UK when Goldsmith Street, which was a council-led development, won the Sterling Prize. It's a big architecture prize here in the UK. And that was excellent. It really did a lot of good business for Passive House. But I think it's just the common sense side of it that hopefully more and more people are demanding it. What I struggle with, and the people that I would love to get through to as well, are those, every so often I'll meet someone who's done an addition or done some work on their homes, and they haven't done much research into energy efficiency or anything like that. And I just think, how do I get to you before you finish?
They've got a great looking kitchen.
The kitchen is fantastic. And some of the granite that they've got on there is
it's amazing.
Yeah. But what do? Do you start advertising for kitchens? Look at the best kitchen blog and then just get them in the back door? I really don't know, but it would be lovely to think that we could get to more of those people, because I'm sure they would love the finished product as everyone else does.
Yeah, which brings me back to your superpower, which I think is communication. And I wanted to talk about how we do that, because, like you say, as engineers, architects, even builders who get really into producing passive houses, we love getting deep dive into the details, talking about psi values and getting out infrared cameras, which is all fantastic stuff. But I think it's great to have people like yourself who do provide that pathway, someone for just the regular public to talk to and to translate some of this stuff and inspire some people. How do you think us, as or those that are deep in the profession and in the details, what do they need to do to communicate Passive House better?
I think a lot of it comes down to those qualities that we already know. It's the comfort, isn't it? You're creating something that's comfort, that's going to have low running costs as well, and just not getting too tied up in all the technical details. I really think it is that simple. And my next mission, if I can get on it, funding the house was nice and easy because I had all the money, but I want to fund a development that's to Passive House standard and show that you can make some money as well and be able to grow things. Because one big issue that, from listening to your podcast, the developers all around the world love to cut corners if they can make more money. And I would love to see the quality there, making a bit of money and keeping the quality there too. Because I think this is going to happen one way or another, isn't it? We're going to make this transition. We might be forced to make this transition, but everything I do in my life is to try and just encourage, what else can we do? I love all the building side of things, but I know there's a complete other side of lifestyle things. And I've been contemplating another podcast, maybe on that, just where I get to think of, sort of fit for my education. I've made my house building podcast very self-centered in that respect, but I'm thinking there's the two of them go together. So that will be another one for when I've got a bit more time on my hands.
Nice. And I think that's That's right. It's a case of money talks, really. If we can show not just that it makes sense from a health, comfort, energy efficiency point of view, but hey, as a developer, as a property owner, this could be a really good financial decision. And I've seen that in conferences where people talk about social housing, where all these other great benefits of improved tenants who look after buildings because
they love it, don't they?
Love them. Yeah.
And
I think I can imagine it's hard to make that case still, though, if you're at the very early stage of that project, to convince all of the parties involved that we're going to spend twice as much on windows as we normally would. But it's that end result that pays off the dividends, but you just got to get there.
And also that early promise that I want to build a passive house. So often, and I don't know why this happens, you find out halfway through a project, someone says, oh yeah, I want to build a passive house. And they've already paid the architects however much money. I've seen this a number of times. But if you say on day one, and you're happy with all the ways to make it cost effective, this is such an upgrade. And unfortunately, you just take it all for granted. This is the horrible thing, just the ventilation is just such a nice thing to have, a room that will dry all your clothes through the winter. And I go past houses, go for a walk right outside mine, and I see condensation all over the windows. And I think it just makes so much sense, doesn't it? You have a ventilation system which actually does what you want with the ventilation. It's all organized. I tell you what, out the kitchen, let's get rid of all the smells as well. I am a very smelly cooker, and bacon sandwiches and all the rest of it. And within a couple of hours, it chugs away just slowly, little by little. But you'd be amazed. The smells, the moisture, it's just a better environment. We all know this. Sorry, I'm repeating myself here.
Well, we do know it, and as I always say, it's really hard to take photos of good performance, and that's why we sometimes do get trumped by nice bathrooms and granite bench tops in the kitchen, because that's what makes great real estate footage and is very, very appealing. But it's those things, like you say, the smells, the heat, the comfort, the dryness and the warmth. That's what we need to communicate. And then from that also back it up with some of the financial benefits downstream of better tenancies, better durability, just better investments.
There's one other point I think that we could add to this, and that is if you visit a passive house, you get it a lot more. And that's where the open days are just brilliant, because you just understand it so much better, and some of those qualities. Whereas I think that market that we can't quite tap into, they're the people that haven't done that. But the more that we get, the more someone, virtually every town now in the UK has its own passive house, or number of them. So as those numbers go up, when you next door to someone who's got sky high heating bills, that's going to tell a story, and they're going to get frustrated by that. So I do think it will evolve, and it must be very satisfying for people like Wolfgang Feist to look at how this has gone, because it's hard, isn't it? We know the construction industry doesn't change much. So to just see over a few decades, we have changed a lot. We are making progress. It's just obviously we'd like to make it a little bit quicker.
Hopefully there will be more activity in the 2021 Passive House Open Days. People are allowed out of their own homes and going visiting.
I'm still not so sure. I hope so.
Yeah, we'll see. But I think that's a really good point, that there's nothing that beats that physical experience. You can't really get the experience of a passive house via Zoom.
And I think that a lot of the people that do go down that process of building a house actually get educated quite quickly.
Yeah.
So, it does. I love that, actually, meeting people day one versus when they finish their house. It's as if they suddenly work in the construction industry. They've gone on a journey. Yeah.
Well, you certainly have gone on a journey, Ben, and it's awesome to hear your enthusiasm is still there, still loving it, and still doing a great job as the industry grows. And you're definitely part of that. You've mentioned a few times that where are the best places for people to connect with you and see what you're up to?
Yeah, I think houseplanninghelp.com is my main website. That's always good to check out. And then I still spend most of my time on Twitter, actually. It's a funny thing. I keep thinking that I will evolve onto other social media, and I do check them, but I still, maybe it's because a lot of the Passive House community seems to be on there, but there as well.
This is true. Yeah, awesome. I will thank you very much for your time. It's great to chat again, and we look forward to keeping in touch and seeing what your next adventure brings.
Well, I will come knocking as soon as I have another story to tell. I'll be
Awesome.
itching to get on.
And that was Ben Adams-Smith there, coming to us from the UK. And we have mentioned in the past that we're very appreciative of all those in Europe who tune into the show. We appreciate that the Global Passive House, the Global Happy Hour is not always at the best time zone for you, but we do know that there are some people who tune in and also listen to this podcast. So big shout out to the UK, Germany, of course, the rest of Europe. It's great to have you as part of this community. And Ben has certainly been a big part of that and continues to be a big part of that, coming from the UK as well.
You're here.
What did you take out of that interview, Zach?
Well, this notion that the quote is, once you start getting into Passive House, you can't really look away. It makes so much sense. And I enjoyed hearing about kind of that journey for him, that to focus on Passive House just because you just can't look away. It makes so much sense. And then the parallel one for you, which I hadn't heard before, but that the Homestyle Green podcast and your initial approach was to be very intentional about being not just Passive House, but now here you are doing the Passive House podcast.
Yeah. And in fact, I started Homestyle Green. Ben started House Planning Help. There's not a mention of Passive House in there because he was at the beginning of this journey with the intention of helping people to work through the process of finding an architect, finding how do you find land, how do you, if you're going to do some building yourself, what skills do you need, what expertise do you need? And it was only along the way where he started thinking, well, it would be nice to, we should make this sustainable, we should make it energy efficient. And the more and more he started asking those questions, the more that Passive House came up as the answer. And now he's a full advocate and living in a Passive House himself. With his background, he's applied the skills and expertise that he's got in not just radio, but also TV. He's got, I was always jealous as a early podcast producer, just the quality of the content that Ben produces. He's quite fanatical about that because he's been in the industry. So he's just got stunning videos, fantastic audio quality for everything he does. And even his web pages look stunning as well. So definitely check that out at houseplanninghelp.com. A lot of it is focused on the UK experience, but it's all very, very useful and easily digestible too.
Yeah. I wasn't aware of the hub. I was aware of the podcast, but I wasn't aware of the hub. And I was poking around there a little bit, and great resources for people who are embarking on that journey of creating an eco home, quote unquote.
Yeah. So Ben's he's keen to offer services and stuff that you can digest just looking through videos and lots of content there. But the hub is to basically create a little bit of a community and also have more of a subscription style service. So if you are looking at embarking on the journey of building your own home and going through that process, whether it's going to be a Passive House or not, that's what the hub is designed for, to go in there and have a helping hand.
Yeah. I also really enjoyed your question about how to, what's the secret to communication around Passive House. And, he came back to comfort, right?
Yep.
And as I was listening, and we do have a challenge communicating about comfort because it's an experiential thing. You can't see comfort. So there's a hurdle, and the things like the open days where people can actually experience one for themselves, or that can be really powerful. But as I was listening to him talk about comfort again, and we know health and comfort, I think a big piece of effective communication around Passive House is being disciplined I think two things: discipline and maybe a little enthusiasm. so,
Yep.
so discipline about remembering. Yes, let's talk about comfort. Let's talk about health. Let's go back there and bring up the benefits of Passive House in those terms, of the fact that you can walk around in bare feet and year round, and that there's fresh air that just is this, full of oxygen. It's not full of the CO2, and maybe we don't talk about CO2 and oxygen. Actually, maybe that's too technical, but
Yep.
I think that there's no deep secret about communicating about Passive House. I think there's just saying, okay, let's bring it back to those experiential benefits, and then finding a place of being able to communicate about those with enthusiasm that's authentic and grounded in your own experience. I mean, I go back to the first time I walked into a Passive House. It was the Karuna House. It's this amazing jewel box house. I mean, it's crazy house in wine country in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And what I was struck by was it felt, that fresh air. I was inside, all the windows were closed, and it was just it felt like I was breathing like this amazing outdoor air. Uh-huh. And I was looking through windows on this incredible landscape. I was like, this is unlike any indoor experience I've ever had.
Yeah.
And I think when people have that first experience and are able to communicate about it, I think, we just, I think, need to be more disciplined about sharing our own stories, and then thinking about how we can share others as well.
That's so true. I mean, I can see you waving your arms around and getting enthusiastic about that. People can just visualize that. But you kind of gave me a little bit goosebumps. I here standing up listening to that, which never happens when someone says 15 kilowatt hours per kilowatt hours per square meter.
Right.
And as engineers, architects, details people, we often do dive down into those numbers, which are really important at some point in the conversation. But I think you're right that passion and enthusiasm are a huge component of communication. Something I also think about is when I'm starting, if I want to communicate, I start with listening, because we have so many benefits to Passive House. It's easy just to try and dump them all out and just overload people with just how great everything is. Mm-hmm. What often works best is to just listen first and find out what's going on for people, what their drivers are, because they might be really motivated about energy efficiency if they've struggled with paying bills or whatever, or they just might really value comfort, or there might be some other trigger there, and we can find out first just by listening what are the drivers for that particular person at that particular time as well, because it changes from time to time, season to season, whatever's going on in their lives. So, it's great to have people. It's great to have people like Ben out there with a different focus, because we do need all these different expertise. We need the technical competence, but we also need to help spread the word. And by having people like that who have that such great experience in mass media, we can definitely learn how to communicate our message better.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that you brought up the listening thing, because that's another realization is that while comfort and health are really valuable go-tos for many people, that it really depends on who you're talking to, like you say. And I've been working on. I've shown you some of the stuff. I'm trying to work on an infographic that captures the different benefits of Passive House for the accelerator. And they're it's like a wheel of 12 different things right now.
Yeah, and you keep thinking of more and more. It's like, it helps this. It helps this.
Last night I heard I was like, it was callbacks, because Dennis Wedlick was talking about no callbacks for contractors. That's a big motivator or benefit that people see. But you're so right. Like for when we're talking to many homeowners, comfort and health may be the thing, or energy efficiency, low utility bills. We're talking to policymakers. It may be that we really need to talk about operational carbon,
Yeah.
Go there, right? It really varies. Or if we're talking, Michael Ingwe's clients in the, in Brooklyn with these drafty old townhomes, it's no dust and no bugs.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So listening to
know your
understand
audience,
who they are. Yeah, totally. Another very basic thing that is easy to forget and takes discipline to remember.
Yeah. You've hinted there at some of the great work going on in the background at the Passive House Accelerator. That's some exciting stuff there, which we might be able to talk about in the future. But in the meantime, lots of stuff going on around the place. Lots of activities happening. You want to give us a quick rundown?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So on Tuesday, Wednesday for Australia and New Zealand of the week that this podcast episode will be published, February 23rd, Jeevan Thaker of HVAC Systems and Solutions will be the guest on Construction Tech Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, we're joined by Laszlo Lepp. He is with Passive House Institute. He'll be presenting about a retrofit, a large retrofit project in Austria, and it's called the Innsbruck Enerfit Plan. So that continues our retrofit theme. And then big news for us is that we just published our first issue of Passive House Accelerator magazine. And so this is
great.
Yeah, it does. This is the work of Mary James and her team. Mary James, for many years, published Passive House Buildings magazine. That magazine is now becoming Passive House Accelerator magazine. And the first issue is all about prefab and Passive House. So that is available for download and for online viewing at our website. So
it's free, right?
It is free. That's right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Awesome.
So we'll share links to all that and all there's as is usually the case, there are tons of educational opportunities as well for both people looking for tradesperson training, builders training, and consultant or designer training in Passive House. We'll share that.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Zach. It's been a pleasure yet again, and also some great chats this week with the always a great time on the happy hour. It's just some really inspiring stuff from a technical point of view, but also some of that social housing and affordable housing. I love it when affordable housing comes together with Passive House because it's just such a great story. So some really really cool stories coming out there.
Yeah, it's been exciting, an exciting week.
All right, we'll catch you next week.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Take care.
Thanks, Zach.
All of the work of Passive House Accelerator, including the Passive House podcast, would be impossible without the support of our sponsors. So we want to take a moment to give a hearty thank you to our sponsors. Our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minotaur, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thank you.